Hi everyone, my name is Jacqueline Luqman and this is Brick by Brick, where we take apart the misinformation, misconceptions, and lies that we've been taught throughout history about our history, and we build a foundation of honesty and truth that we can build a better future on, and we do it brick by brick. So if you joined me last week, you know that we started our series on examining why what we were seeing at Standing Rock in Cannonball, North Dakota, with the disrespect and the abuse of our indigenous brothers and sisters, is not anything new in the history of not only this country, but of the world. We talked about the beginning of or the origins of a concept called the Doctrine of Discovery that came out of an era called the Age of Exploration, when European explorers were sailing around the world, basically discovering what they believed were new lands that they didn't know were there. But what were they really doing? They said usually that they were doing this to expand Christianity, to spread Christianity across the globe. But when we look at the exploits of one particularly famous explorer, Christopher Columbus, we see that spreading Christianity really wasn't what they were trying to do. So during the age of exploration, as I said, all of these European explorers sailed around the world, basically stealing land from people who already inhabited it. And not only stealing land, but stealing resources and even stealing people. The doctrine of discovery is based on the idea that came out of the Catholic Church, specifically from popes, saying that Christian nations had the right to claim land for the quote unquote kingdom of God and to claim everything and everyone in those lands for the alleged kingdom. Uh, the popes usually stipulated that explorers who found or discovered these lands could take possession of them for their king and their country and their church, as long as they were not already claimed by another Christian nation. And they could do with the land, the materials, and the people already living in and on that land whatever they chose. The official record was always that the explorers were going to convert the indigenous people to Christianity. But as we examine the legacy of Christopher Columbus tonight, we're going to see that expanding Christianity really was never on at least his mind. So let's start where we left off last week. Remember, we talked about how the Treaty of Tordesillas basically was a peace pact between the kings of Portugal and the king of Spain, and the Pope, Alexander VI, mediated between the two to divide the known world up between the two kingdoms. And if you see here on the map that was a result of the Treaty of Tordesillas, then Spain was allowed to explore and claim all of this land to the west of this line. That includes the North American landmass and South America. And and Portugal was allowed to explore and claim all of this landmass to the east of this line of demarcation. Now, let's be honest here. There was no authority given to anyone that would allow them to legally, to logically, to rightfully lay claim to entire land masses. The doctrine of discovery is based on nothing more than particular popes' ideas that they could profit off of the discovery of new cultures, and they were allowed to do it solely because they were Christians. Allegedly, they were Christians. The interesting thing is, as we talked about last week, this was a belief that came down from the Pope. It was not necessarily a belief that was held by lay Catholics or lay Christians, because most Christians couldn't read at that time. As a matter of fact, the most literate people in most kingdoms were the popes, some kings, some queens, and almost all of the priests. So the pope, the priests, could tell the laity whatever they felt like telling them God said they could and could not do. And they could tell them, well, this is in the Bible, this is the word of God. And how would the laity know that they're being lied to? Because they couldn't read their own holy texts. So let's talk about specifically the legacy of Christopher Columbus tonight. Because the claim that Christopher Columbus discovered North America is an obvious lie. We all know that it's a lie now. And for those of you who are watching who may not know that it's a lie, I am now telling you it is a lie. Christopher Columbus did not sail the ocean blue in 1492 and discover North America. Christopher Columbus did not land on North America. He didn't come anywhere near North America. I'm going to switch back to this map to show you where Christopher Columbus, I probably can't even show it to you here, but he actually landed in Haiti. He believed that he was landing in Asia, specifically India, because the purpose for him embarking on these expeditions was to find a faster route from Europe to Asia in order to speed up and take greater advantage of the spice trade. But he got lost. He miscalculated. And he ended up on the island of what we know today as Hispaniola, or the Dominican Republic in Haiti. And on that island, he encountered the Taino people, or the Arawaks. And please forgive me if I am mispronouncing anything. Send me an inbox message on Brick by Brick. Let me know that I'm mispronouncing it. Help me pronounce it correctly. I'm terrible with pronouncing foreign names and foreign words, so please give me a little bit of grace. So when we're talking about Christopher Columbus discovering America, he didn't. He happened upon a culture that already existed in the Caribbean. But here are some interesting things I bet you didn't know about Christopher Columbus and what he actually discovered, and who was actually the first to discover anything. The Viking explorer Leif Erikson is believed to have been the first European to actually set foot on North America. Leif Erikson is believed to have landed in Canada, sailed to Canada 1,000 years before Christopher Columbus was even born. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. He landed in Canada in 1000 AD, 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born. So, as far as historians are concerned, Leif Erikson discovered North America. But even that's questionable because there were people in North America before Leif Erikson got there. So he didn't really discover anything. He was just the first European to happen upon it. And there was another explorer by the name of John Cabot, a British explorer who landed on North America before Christopher Columbus ever got to Hispaniola also. So we've been lied to for quite a long time about who discovered North America all throughout our entire education. So let's talk about what Christopher Columbus really did. Now, he negotiated with Ferdinand and Isabella, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, to receive 10% of the profits of whatever he brought back to them in exchange for doing this wonderful feat of exploration. So it wasn't really about the excitement and the importance of discovery. Was it really about expanding the kingdom of Christ for God? Or was Christopher Columbus really just after some loot? Well, when we look at the record, we find out what his motivations really were. Christopher Columbus wrote a journal, and we know a lot about what he did, what he thought, what he saw, and what his intentions really were from his own words. So what I'm going to do is explain to you what Christopher Columbus himself says he saw, what he said he did, and we're going to talk about how those things impacted the people he encountered on Hispaniola. So the people Christopher Columbus encountered were the Taino or Arawak Indians, and Columbus himself said that they were peaceful and generous people. From his own journal, Columbus says, "So that they may feel great friendship for us, and because I knew that they were a people who would be better delivered and converted to our holy faith by love than by force, I gave to some of them red caps and glass bells, which they put around their necks, and many other things of little value, in which they took much pleasure, and they remained so friendly to us that it was wonderful. Afterwards they came swimming to the ship's boats where we were, and they brought us parrots and cotton thread and skeins and javelins and many other things, and they bartered them with us for other things which we gave them, such as little glass beads and little bells. In short, they took everything and gave of what they had with good will. But it seemed to me that they were a people very destitute of everything, because some of the people wore small gold ornaments in their ears, but they gave so freely of everything they had." I think it's very interesting to note that Columbus speaks glowingly of the generosity and the kindness and the friendliness of these people he encounters when he disembarks from his ships in Hispaniola, and how they were free in giving and sharing whatever they had. But it was the small gold earrings, the small gold ornaments that the Taino people wore in their ears that piqued Columbus's interest in not just exploring for the sake of exploring, but for exploiting the Taino people. Because he wanted the gold, he wanted to find the source of the gold, and he knew he didn't know where it was. He captured the first group of Indians, of Taino Indians, to lead him to where they found the gold. They were the first slaves that Christopher Columbus captured. He goes on in his journals to say that in observing the people, he knew that they had experienced armed conflict because some of them had wounds, as if they'd been fighting, even though he noted that they didn't have weapons as they were familiar with, iron specifically. But he could tell that some of the men had obviously been in some type of conflict where they had healed from wounds. So he surmised that there were other tribes of people living on other islands who may have waged war with the Taino people, and he realized that, well, the Taino people fought back. They didn't want to be taken captive or subjugated or mistreated by another tribe of people. He notes this in his journal. Christopher Columbus says, "They do not bear arms, nor do they know them, for I showed them swords, and they took them by the edge, and they cut themselves through ignorance. They have no iron at all. Their javelins are rods without iron, and some of them have a fish's tooth at the end, and some of them other things. They are all of good stature, and good graceful appearance, well made. I saw some who had scars of wounds in their bodies, and I made signs to them to ask what that was, and they showed me how people came there from other islands which lay around and tried to take them captive, and they defended themselves. And I believed, and I still believe, that they came there from the mainland to take them for captives." Columbus is talking about the other tribes of people who live on the mainland or on a bigger island who came to this little island of Hispaniola to take the Taino people captive. And he knew that the Taino people defended themselves. So how did he get from knowing that this group of peaceful, kind, generous, friendly people defended themselves from being taken captive by another tribe of indigenous people to being completely all right with enslaving the very same people he spoke so highly of? Well, despite Columbus's observations of their peacefulness and obvious resistance to being made captives, he had planned to make captives of the Taino people from the very beginning. In his journal, he says, "They would be good servants and of good disposition, for I see that they repeat very quickly everything which is said to them, and I believe that they could easily be made Christians." That's the cover. What he really wanted to do was the first thing he said, to make them good servants. "For it seems to me that they have no belief. I, if it please our Lord," and I should pause here and note that when he uses Lord in this context, he's not saying the Lord Jesus Christ or the Lord our God. He means his king. He says, "I, if it please our Lord, will take 6 of them to your highness at the time of my departure, so that they may learn to talk." This is where he takes 6 Taino people captive so that he can learn their language, they can learn his, and they can show him where to find the gold. The interesting thing is that even though Pope Alexander, King Ferdinand, and Queen Isabella, and Columbus all claimed to have wanted to expand Christendom, When Columbus seemed to believe and realize that the Taino people were actually worshiping God, because I just read in his journal that he thought at first that they didn't believe in anything, that they didn't worship anything. But later he realizes, no, they do believe in some type of deity. They do believe in some type of above power, or power coming from the heavens. But he still sought to enslave them. Excuse me, from his journal. At daybreak, I had the ship's boat and the boats of the caravels made ready, and I sailed along the island toward the northeast to see the other port, what there was there, and also to see the towns. And I soon saw two or three, and the people who were all coming to the shore, calling us and giving thanks to God. Remember, this is after he had taken 6 Taino Indians captive, taught them his language. He learned theirs. So there is an ability to communicate now. And this is upon his return to Hispaniola with some of those captives, and they go and tell people who are left on the island, and the people are meeting the ships now. Some people brought us water, others things to eat. Others, when they saw that I did not care to go ashore, threw themselves into the sea and came swimming. And we understood that they asked us if we had come from heaven. Christopher Columbus knew that the Taino people had an understanding or a belief in some deity that was greater than themselves. And an old man came into the boat, and others called all the rest, men and women, with a loud voice, "Come and see the men who have come from heaven. Bring them food and drink." This is what the Taino people said of Columbus and his fellow explorers when they returned to Hispaniola. He goes on to say, "There came many of them, and many women, each one with something, giving thanks to God, casting themselves on the ground and raising their heads toward heaven. And afterwards they called us with shouts to come ashore." And I was moved to see all this morning, so that I might be able to give an account of it all to your highness, and also to find out where I might make a fortress. And I saw a piece of land formed like an island, although it is not one, in which there were 6 houses, which could be cut off in 2 days so as to become an island, although I do not see that it is necessary, as this people is very ignorant of arms, and your highness will see from 7 whom I had taken, I'm sorry, it was 7, not 6, to carry them off to learn our speech and to bring them back again. But your highness, when you direct, can take them all to Castile, or keep them captives in this same island, for with 50 men you can keep them all subjected and make them do whatever you like. For all of the lofty, flowery talk of these expeditions being about expanding the Christian faith and converting whatever people are found to the Christian faith, to advance and spread the kingdom of God, if you know that the inhabitants of the island do have a belief in a deity greater than themselves that comes from heaven, why would you want to subjugate them? Christopher Columbus even notes in a letter to one of his benefactors, one of the people who helped pay for his voyages, the peacefulness and the generosity and the intelligence and the spirituality of the indigenous people. And I think I have that here. And whether it be a thing of value or one of little worth, They are straightways content with whatsoever trifle, of whatsoever kind, may be given them in return for it. I forbade that anything so worthless as fragments of broken platters and pieces of broken glass and strap buckles should be given them, although when they were able to get such things, they seemed to think that they had the best jewel in the world. And they knew no sect, no idolatry, save that they all believe that power and goodness are in the sky. And they believed very firmly that I, with these ships and crew, came from the sky, and in such opinion they received me at every place where I landed, after they had lost their terror. And this comes not because they are ignorant. On the contrary, they are men of very subtle wit, who navigate all those seas, and who give a marvelously good account of everything. But because they never saw men wearing clothes, nor like that of our ships. Christopher Columbus, in his own words, acknowledges that he does not believe the Taino people are ignorant in the sense that we understand and look down upon ignorance, as if they are unlearned. He does not view them as childlike. He does not view them as even heathens. He acknowledges not only their intelligence, their skill at navigating and maritime mastery. He acknowledges their spirituality. But what he wanted from them was not respect. What he wanted from them was not a relationship of mutual admiration, and not even beneficial in regard to trade. What he wanted from them was their gold. So, further in Columbus's journals, the more you read what he writes about what he's doing on the island and why he's there and what he sees, you begin to understand what's going on in his head. Christopher Columbus is thinking only about the money he's going to make. And even though he recognizes the humanity of the Taino people, you just heard me read his words, extolling the virtues of the indigenous people of Hispaniola from the very beginning. Columbus and the Spaniards never intended to convert any of these people to any faith. Regardless of what they said, what they did proved that they were after money. Because of Columbus's exaggerated report and promises that he sent back to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, his second expedition, he was given even more ships and more than 1,200 men. So the aim there was very clear. It wasn't to forge a relationship that was mutually beneficial with the Taino people. You only take 1,200 men and 17 ships to an island that is inhabited by peaceful people who are kind and generous and who have received you with open arms, if you want to take what's theirs. That was an unmistakable show of force. Columbus and his crew went from island to island in the Caribbean, taking Indians as captives. And by the way, I should tell you, the word Indians comes from Christopher Columbus believing that he had landed in India. So he called the people he saw there Indians. But as word spread among the tribes of the Europeans' intent, the indigenous people retreated deeper into the interiors of the island. So Columbus and the explorers found more and more empty villages. When they got to Haiti, they found that the sailors that were left behind, actually, from the first expedition at Fort Navidad, had been killed in a battle with the Indians. Now, I know that I didn't know anything about Fort Navidad for most of my educational life. But Fort Navidad is a very, very interesting story because remember me reading a few minutes ago Christopher Columbus's desire to build a fort on a piece of land that already had 6 houses on it, and he was willing to tear the houses of the people who lived there down and create an island where he could build a fort. Well, he did, and he called it Fort Navidad, or Fort Christmas. And he left 39 of his men at the fort when he went back to Spain to take the first 7 Taino Indians as gifts to the king and queen. And when he returned on the second voyage with the 17 ships and the 1,200 men, all 39 of the men who were originally at Fort Navidad had been killed, and Fort Navidad had been burned to the ground. Now, at this point, Columbus could communicate a little bit with the indigenous people. So he's asking around, what happened? What happened? And of course, no one's telling him. But the people of these islands had seen the brutality that the Spaniards had visited upon their people. And in the case of Fort Navidad, these 39 Spaniards were kidnapping and raping the women of the Taino people. They were murdering the children, and they were enslaving the men. Now, I'm going to share this amazing video with you. Normally, I wouldn't have a video this long. It's about 5 minutes. But I think it's very, very important to understand the context through which the Taino people were living, and why Fort Navidad and the 39 members of the first exploration team were decimated. So, I have to warn you, this video is very graphic. It's about 5 minutes, but it will help you understand a little bit of the hell that was unleashed upon these people that even Christopher Columbus admitted were peaceful and kind and generous and intelligent. This is what was done to them.
All the following quotes are taken from the book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, written in 1542 by Bartolomé de las Casas, 16th century Spanish Dominican priest who settled in the New World, sailed on one of Christopher Columbus's voyages, transcribed Christopher Columbus's diary, and accompanied Diego Velázquez during the conquest of Cuba.
It all began with the Europeans taking native women and children, both as servants and to satisfy their own base appetites. The Spanish fell like ravening wolves upon the fold, or like tigers and savage lions who have not eaten meat for days. I saw with my own eyes how the Spaniards burned countless local inhabitants alive, or hacked them to pieces, or devised novel ways of torturing them to death, enslaving those they took alive. This commander caused 4,500 of them to be branded as common slaves. It did not make any difference between men and women, taking and branding even the children from 1 to 5 years of age, some of them still unweaned. They grabbed suckling infants by the feet and ripping them from their mother's breast, dashed them headlong against the rocks. One Spaniard, who wished to satisfy his evil lust on a young girl, took out his dagger, or as it may be his sword, and cut off the hand of the girl's mother, who was trying to wrench her from his grasp. When the girl persisted in refusing him, he stabbed her to death. The soldiers stuck their swords into the guts of the women and the young girls, massacring every single one of them. A Spaniard took a little boy from his mother, cut his arms and legs into chunks with his knife, and distributed them among his dogs. Another member of the governor's party galloped about cutting the legs off all the children. They spared no one, erecting especially white gibbets on which they could string their victims up with their feet just off the ground and then burn them alive, 13 at a time, in honor of our Savior and the 12 apostles. Some they chose to keep alive and simply cut their wrists, leaving their hands dangling. Some began to flee into the hills, while others were in such despair that they took their own lives. Men and women hanged themselves and even strung up their own children. The reason the Christians have murdered on such a vast scale, killed anyone and everyone in their way, is purely and simply greed. They have set out to line their pockets with gold.
disturbing and really, really hard to watch. But you need to know that the Taino Indians of Haiti no longer exist. Christopher Columbus and his expedition crew sent wave after wave of expeditions into the interior of Haiti looking for gold, all because of the small gold ornaments that he saw worn in the ears of the Taino people. And the interesting thing was, Haiti is not a gold-rich island. So whatever gold was found was in such small amount that it was almost literally of no value to Columbus or Spain. So Columbus found no gold fields, but he had to fill up his ships with something of value when he went back to Spain. So in 1495, Columbus went on an enormous slave raid, rounded up 1,500 Taino men, women, and children, put them in pens guarded by Spaniards and dogs, and then picked 500 of the best specimens, loaded them onto ships, and with the intention of taking them back to Spain as some type of cargo, as some type of bounty. But of those 500, 200 died en route. The rest arrived alive in Spain and were put up for sale by the archdeacon of the town. And he reported that although the slaves were naked as the day they were born, that might have been the very first written reference that I've seen of that phrase, I'm not sure, they showed no more embarrassment than animals. Columbus later wrote, "Let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, go on sending all the slaves that can be told." Let's be very clear here. Columbus isn't doing this in the name of anybody's Holy Trinity. He's not doing this in the name of anybody's God. He's not doing this for the Pope. He's not doing this for the church. He's not doing this for his king and queen. He's doing it for the money. Because the slaves who were sold, I'm sorry, let me correct that. The Arawak Indians who were taken captive, who were sold, fetched a high price. So the words on that video come from someone named Bartolomé de las Casas. And he's a very, very important figure in the history and the legacy of Christopher Columbus, because de las Casas translated or transcribed Columbus's journals. It is because of de las Casas that we know what Columbus said, what he did, what he thought, what his intentions were. So, as Columbus and the Spaniards continue slave raids, thousands and thousands of Arawak men, women, and children die in captivity on the islands. They die in transit. They die in captivity in Spain. They die working, looking for gold. They're massacred by the Spaniards. Columbus and his men ordered all persons 14 years or older to collect a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. Hadn't found any gold mines now. When they brought it, What little they found, they were given copper tokens to hang around their necks to prove that they had met their quota. Indians found without a copper token had their hands cut off, and they bled to death. And because there were no massive gold mines, that was a lot of Arawak Indians. They had been given an impossible task because the only gold around was bits of dust from the streams. So they fled, and they were hunted with dogs. They were killed, like in the video. But they fought back. They tried to. The Arawaks tried to put together an army of resistance, but they faced a Spanish force that had armor, muskets, swords, horses, dogs. And when the Spaniards took prisoners of the Arawaks who tried to fight back, they hanged them or burned them to death, burned them alive. So the Arawaks began to commit mass suicide with cassava poison. And that's very ironic because cassava was the staple crop of the Arawak people. Parents killed their babies to keep them from enduring the horrors of the Spaniards. And in 2 years, through murder, mutilation, suicide, half of the 250,000 Arawak Indians on the island of Haiti were dead. Half of them in just 2 years. And after it became clear that there was no gold, then more Indians were taken as slaves. And some of the first plantations in that part of the world were built on Haiti. They were known at that time as encomiendas. And there, the rest of the Arawak Indians were worked to death. By the year 1515, there were maybe 50,000 Indians left. By 1550, there were 500. And a final report of the year 1650 showed that not one of the original Arawaks or their descendants were left on the island of Haiti. It had only taken 155 years for the Spaniards to completely eliminate the entire Arawak population, the entire Arawak people from the island of Haiti. As I said, we know about some of the atrocities that were committed by the Spaniards under the leadership of Christopher Columbus because of Bartolomé de las Casas. And this is another place where the question of religion comes into this discussion because, interestingly enough, de las Casas was a priest. Now, he was a priest who at first participated willingly in the conquest of Cuba, and he even owned a plantation on which Indian slaves worked. And at one time, he advocated for replacing Indian slaves with African slaves because the Indian slaves were dying off so quickly. And he felt that the African slaves would have been stronger and would have been able to withstand the harsh conditions. But he changed his mind about the whole slavery business when he saw that African slaves were dying off too. And he began to see how brutal this entire practice was. So he got out of the whole slavery business. And in his 50s, he began transcribing Columbus's journal, and he wrote a multi-volume work called The History of the Indies. And it is in the history of the Indies where De las Casas chronicles many of these atrocities. When he arrived in Hispaniola in 1508, Las Casas says there were 60,000 people living on this island, including the Indians. That this was after the first wave of genocide. So we're talking at this point just 60,000 people on the island, including the Indians. So that from 1494 to 1508, he estimated over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. Now, 3 million is a number that is still very much in dispute. But even if he got the number wrong, De las Casas understood that there was a massive, massive decimation of human life that happened on Haiti. And even he was appalled by it. He said, who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. He writes about the effect of the Spaniards' brutality on basic human life. Something as mundane as maintaining a family. He says that while the men were sent miles away to what little mines there were, the wives remained to work the soil, forced into the excruciating job of digging and making thousands of hills for cassava plants, because you see, now they had to feed the Spaniards. They couldn't just maintain crops for themselves and their families and their tribe, their villages. Now they had to feed these thousands of Spaniards. De las Casas says, thus husbands and wives were together only once every 8 or 10 months. And when they met, they were so exhausted and depressed on both sides, they ceased to procreate. Now I have to stop right there. We are all familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder. We are all familiar with the crippling disease of depression and how it affects your every function. How stress actually has physical effects that can manifest in your body, and a reduction in the production of hormones that regulate everything from your skin, the moisture in your skin, to your reproduction. Can you imagine living through this period and you are a Taino Indian and you are watching your people be eliminated? You are seeing it before your eyes. These are people who tried to survive, and they were so beaten down by the Spaniards, literally ground into the ground, that they did not even have the will anymore to continue basic human functions, like procreate. As for the newly born, the few that there were, they died early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them. And for this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months. Some mothers even drowned their babies from sheer desperation. In this way, husbands died in the mines, wives died at work, and children died from lack of milk. And in a short time, this land, which was so great, so powerful, and so fertile, was depopulated. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature, and now I tremble as I write. Here is a young priest. Well, at this point when he's writing this, he's not young anymore. He's 51 years old, and he is recounting what he saw as the Spaniards, under the guise of the faith that he also is a part of, eliminated an entire people. So for an alternative view of the Christian perspective, this whole they did this because they were Christians and Christianity is evil, well, how do you explain De Las Casas if Christianity is the problem? Because De Las Casas strongly condemned the Spaniards, and particularly for doing what they did under the guise of the Christian faith. In Book 2 of his History of the Indies, Las Casas tells about the treatment of the Indians by the Spaniards, and he says, endless testimonies prove the mild and pacific temperature of the natives, but our work was to exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. Small wonder, then, if they tried to kill one of us now and then. The admiral, it is true, was blind as those who came after him. He's talking about Christopher Columbus here. And he was so anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against the Indians. He talks about how the Spaniards grew more conceited every day, and after a while, they refused to even walk. And they rode the backs of the Indians if they were in a hurry, or were carried on hammocks by Indians running in relays. In this case, they also had Indians carry large leaves to shade them from the sun. Las Casas talks about the total control that led to total cruelty by the Spaniards. He said they thought nothing of knifing Indians by 10s and 20s and of cutting slices off them to test the sharpness of their blades. He tells of how two of these so-called Christians met two Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots and for fun beheaded the boys. Now here's someone who himself was involved in the enslavement of not just Indians, but of Africans. Because while this was going on in the Caribbean islands, something similar was going on in Africa, and the Portuguese were doing that. But because of his faith, the very same faith, De Las Casas looks at what the Spaniards are doing and realizes this is all wrong, and they're not even Christian. He calls them so-called Christians. So none of this was done because of the Christian faith. It was all done because of greed. So we come to the question of how did all of this history of what Christopher Columbus actually did, how did it get whitewashed? How in the world do we still celebrate and hold with high regard and esteem organizations like the Knights of Columbus? How did they continue to hold Christopher Columbus in such esteem? Well, we had people who translated the history or who conveyed the history to modern times who completely whitewashed all of those crimes. One of those people was Samuel Elliott Morrison. He's a Harvard historian, very, very highly esteemed historian. He was the most distinguished writer on Columbus. He was the author of a multi-volume biography, and he was himself a sailor who retraced Columbus's route across the Atlantic. In his popular book, Christopher Columbus, Mariner, written in 1954, he tells about the enslavement and the killing, and he says the cruel policy initiated by Columbus and pursued by his successors resulted in complete genocide. That's all he said about it. It was on one page. It was buried halfway into the telling of this grand romantic story that we have all been indoctrinated with about Christopher Columbus and his marvelous exploits. And in the book's very last paragraph, Morrison sums up his view of Columbus like this. He had his faults and his defects, but they were largely the defects of the qualities that made him great. His indomitable will, his superb faith in God, and his own mission as the Christ bearer to lands beyond the seas, his stubborn persistence despite neglect, poverty, and discouragement. But there was no flaw, no dark side to the most outstanding and essential of all his qualities, his seamanship. Now, he just said in the same book that Columbus pursued policies that were cruel and resulted in genocide. But, I mean, those were just defects in his quality. Those were just defects of the qualities that made him great. And this is where the insidious nature of the doctrine of discovery serves to render people who are outside of a belief system that those with authority and power, those who control the narrative of history, deem unworthy to be considered worthy enough to be included in the narrative of history. This is where the doctrine of discovery has served to give us this vile, violent, genocidal history of abuse, oppression, and theft in our relationship with Native Americans. This is where it comes from. Because make no mistake about it, what Columbus did was not unusual or isolated. It's vile, it's disgusting. What we talked about tonight was the legacy of Columbus, not the nice poem that we all learned in school. What we talked about tonight, the disappearance of the Taino people, that's Columbus's legacy. Genocide is his legacy. But understand that what Columbus did to the Arawaks in the Bahamas, Cortez did to the Aztecs in Mexico. Pizarro did to the Incas in Peru. And the English settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts did to the Powhatans and the Pequots. And next week, that's what we're going to talk about. So, I hope you guys learned something new that you didn't know before tonight. I hope you take this information, and I want you to go to Facebook. Here's your one piece of homework tonight. Go to Facebook. Find some Facebook groups that are focused on and owned and run by indigenous people, not just in this country, but in other countries, but definitely our Native brothers and sisters in this country. Join those groups and learn about the history and the culture of our Native American brothers that you probably haven't learned because you weren't taught it in school. Thank you so much for joining me here at Brick by Brick. As I said, next week we're going to talk about the English settlers, the colonies, probably the first Thanksgiving, what really happened, and how our relationship with Native Americans is impacted by the doctrine of discovery. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Join me next week at 9 p.m. on Wednesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Brick by Brick. I am Jacqueline Luqman. Have a great night.
Building it brick by brick.